On today's episode, we are making the first half of our two-piece mold. Hey guys, what's going on? It's Michael here. So today we are making the first half of our two-piece mold, or rather we're casting it in silicone. So I've got this on fast forward. Just because you've seen me make molds before, but we'll slow it down when you get to parts that you've not seen before. So I'm just basically doing my rice grain technique right now, where I pour some rice into our mold, which will give us the volume that we need to mix up with the silicone. So the rice, as you can see, kind of sticks to the clay a little bit, so I'm using a paintbrush to get some of this out. But you can use whatever tool you have on hand. You can see that I had to switch to pliers to actually get some of this rice out of here where it's being stubborn. The clay is a little sticky, so the rice tends to want to stay in there, but that would screw up our silicone mold, so we want to make sure and get all of that out. And then we'll just pour the rice into a disposable cup. We'll throw it on the vibrator for a few seconds just to settle it down to the bottom of the cup, and then we'll just draw our line with the Sharpie. Now remember, like every other mold that I've shown you how to do, because we add an activator to this, it's going to be a little bit overfilled above the line that we've just drawn on this cup, meaning you'll have more silicone than you actually needed to mix. So when you do this, you can short fill it by just a hair and plan on that activator overfilling your line by just a little bit. So I take that into account whenever I mix this. Now, Smooth On used to give us these nice glass bottles for all the activators, and this is the first one that I have bought that comes in this little plastic container. And I don't know that anybody from Smooth On will ever see this video, but if you do, this thing is ridiculous to try to pour a small amount. It goes everywhere, it runs down the side of the bottle. I think I'm going to have to use funnels, but I don't want to pour too much. It got all over my scale. I'm just saying it's a pain compared to what it used to be. But, c'est la vie, right? So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to just give this a good stir, and if you've noticed in the background, that's my friend Ralph, who's over while I'm working on this, and he's just checking out what I'm doing. So we've got 5 minutes to stir this up, all sped up for you so you don't have to wait through the whole 5-minute process. Once it's good and stirred, then comes the next step, which is actually something a little different from what you guys have seen me do in previous molds. We actually have to prepare the clay part of our mold so that it is non-stick, so that we can get it off of the silicone, or the silicone off of it, however you want to think of it. So we're going to do that twofold. We're going to brush on a mold release agent, and then we are also going to spray on a mold release agent. The brush on is of course going to be a little heavier. That's what I've got in my hand right now, which it will do a better job at coating all surfaces so that we are totally non-stick. So we want to give that a good shake and pour a little bit of it out into our cup. Now I'm using the mold release agent that Smooth On makes, which is the Man 205, which is their brush on version of it, and I'm going to put a liberal coat over the entire surface, but we want to make sure to put it down thin enough that it doesn't pool. If you have puddles of liquid on this surface, it will screw up the mold that we're about to make. The silicone is not able to displace that liquid, so you'll just get a void in your mold, which will want to fill in with your plaster when you run this cast. So like I said, make sure it doesn't puddle, but make sure that you're coating everything really well. So we'll brush this out, and then immediately following the brush out, we're going to spray on our spray-on mold release agent, which is the Smooth On Man 200. Now make sure with this brush on one you don't waste anything. I can pour it back into the container, we can screw the lid back on and save it for later. The stuff's expensive, you don't want to pitch it. So I have 2 cans of my spray-on because one's almost empty, and after a quick little mist, we are ready to brush out that spray-on to make sure that it is evenly coated over all surfaces. Make sure that you brush it up onto the sides of your mold as well as just the pieces and the clay, because you want it to evenly cover the sides of your mold so that you don't get any silicone that permanently wants to stay stuck to your Lego bricks or to your dry erase board. Now once you've gotten a good coating on it, you're going to allow it to dry for 5 minutes. That 5-minute time will give us an opportunity to move the cameras around for the next couple of shots that we need to do. And I've got an ingenious tripod of the container that my silicone came in to give you this shot. So once you're dry and ready, you're ready to start pouring. Now I like to do this with the mold already sitting on the vibration table. You can see there that I just turned it on. The little bit of vibration helps it flow a little more evenly out into all the corners of the mold. I generally just pour this in the middle because my table is really perfectly level, but you can pour this into the lowest spot on your mold and let it flow upwards from there. When you pour this, by having it on the vibration table, all the bubbles that are trapped in this silicone will want to release. The other trick to this is to pour a very, very thin stream, as you can see I'm doing. If you pour it heavy, you're going to get more bubbles in your finished product. Once you've poured it, turn up your vibration table to a higher setting, and if it's wanting to dance around like mine is with just a couple of rubber bands, throw a couple of clamps in it. That will ensure that all the bubbles rise out of the mold and to the surface. Now after that little cutaway, we've allowed this mold to have a good 4 hours dry time to fully cure, just like I show in my other videos, and it's ready to pull. Now be sure that when you pull this, you're not actually separating the first half silicone from your Lego block mold. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking one of my widest putty knives. This is a 6-inch and it is flexible, which makes the blade a little thinner. And I'm just gently sliding it underneath of my Lego block form. What I want to do is I want to break the glue that I used to tack this down to my dry erase board, and I want to break the suction that the clay has caused onto the dry erase board itself. The goal here is to get this off of the dry erase board bottom without flexing the Lego blocks to break that seal that the silicone has made. If you flex them and you create a gap along the wall where the Lego blocks are, you're going to get a weird second half to this mold. So I'm just being very careful, taking my time, and there we go, we have popped it off. Now looking at this, you can see where a little bit of silicone has run down all the way through. It's to be expected that you will get some leaks around your clay, but you shouldn't see a disaster of silicone when you pull this off, where you're going to have a lot of work to do to get the mold ready. Your dry erase board could be reused if you chose to. I'm scraping off the clay so that I have the option to reuse mine. But it's really not necessary. You don't necessarily have to use that again. At this point, what we want to do is we want to remove the clay that is filling in one half of our mold. Along with this clay, we're going to take out those little ball bearing beads that we placed in there to act as reference marks. So use whatever tool you have lying around to get yourself a good handhold on the clay. Just be careful, don't dig in too deep or you're going to scar the silicone mold that you just worked so hard to make. So once you've gotten the clay lifted up, it'll go a lot easier and you'll be able to start pulling it out in larger blocks. Now the clay that I'm getting here is the first bit of clay that I put into the bottom of the form. None of this clay came into contact with the large amount of mold release agent that I brushed on. So all of that clay I can reuse. So I'll just wad it up into a ball and I will use this clay again later for another mold that I have to make. If you pull out any of those ball bearings as you're doing this, make sure you throw them into cups so that you can keep them out of your clay and use them again later. You want to get all of the clay out of this. Don't leave any residue behind or it's going to affect your finished product. Make sure that you take your time around any of the fine details, and you'll see later in this video that I actually use a variety of tools to scrape out any of those little troublesome areas. So you can see that I'm starting to get down to the pieces of clay that directly came into contact with the mold release agent. Now you would not want to reuse that clay that came into contact with the mold release just simply because it's going to have a grease to it and it's not going to work as well later. At this point in the project I decided that I didn't really want to save any of this clay, so you can see I just sort of wadded it all together rather than throwing the portion of it away, which is what I had intended to do. So right now I'm trying to pull out the small pieces of clay from the insides of our round recesses, and I'm paying careful attention to make sure that I'm not leaving any bits of that clay behind. This is a slow going process just simply for that reason. You want to be really careful to not leave clay residue behind, and I'm trying to save these little ball bearings so that I can use them again later. If you notice, the ball bearings did their job perfectly and they've left these perfectly round little reference marks all over the first half of our silicone. Those will help us line the two halves of this mold up later and give us a perfectly joining mold that we can pour into from the end that is actually on its side right now. We've got just a little bit more of the clay left that we're pulling out of the mold right now, and we're going to save these ball bearings, and then we've got a little bit of cleanup to do. You can see that the silicone squeezed out a little bit, or rather seeped out a little bit on the bottom as we poured this mold. My suspicion here is that it ran down one of the corners along the edges of the actual dry erase board that we glued these pieces to, and that's what allowed it to seep down across the bottom. So I started to rip this off and I decided that I didn't want to pull and tug on the mold too much, so I actually switched out to both a pair of scissors and a small X-Acto knife just so that I could clean up this this little bit of silicone seepage without causing any damage to the mold. You want this as clean as you can make it, because any little bits of this that you leave behind will affect the actual detail in your final mold. So I'm taking my time with this, but we're going to speed up this process for you just so that you're not watching it at a snail's pace. It's kind of mundane little detail work, but the better that you have this, the cleaner that it is, the better your mold is going to be in the final product. You'll also notice that I have little bits of residue of the clay on this mold from when we actually cast it. All of that will need to be cleaned off before we can do the final part of this mold, which is to pour the silicone in the other half. That clay residue will cause us to lose some detail in the final product, and for that we're going to use a mix of a mild detergent and some water to do our cleanup. So we're all done with this part of the video. You can check out the mold. We are ready to go to pour our final half of this. With this half of the mold in place, we won't get any seepage from the silicone as we pour the other half. So make sure you check out part 3 where we'll make the other half of this mold. Hey, if you like these videos and want to help me keep making them, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button.